Hi, welcome to Vibration Cinema, the altered destiny of film. Today, we're going to be looking at Patrik-Ian Polk's 2000 hit indie debut film, Punks. Punks is a hangout film, which is a kind of film where the characters just kind of chill together. It's a slice of life film where there is a narrative, but it's not a journey, there's no grand design. And yeah, there are buddy movies where you want to vibe out with the characters, but a hangout movie is one where you actually feel like you are. And this kind of style, which I think is really hard to pull off, is signature Patrik. So it's incredible to see how well he harnessed this form so early in his career. In a retrospective interview with AAFCA celebrating his 20-year career, Polk talks about his guiding principle, which I think is key to how he can achieve this style of film so well.
You know, the central premise really for all of my work, it is, yes, telling Black gay stories, but if you boil it down to, even smaller, it's wanting to see myself on screen. That's what it has always been about. Growing up, never seeing myself and wanting to see myself. That is what these 20 years of making movies and television has been about for me. A lot of it was, again, with Punks, I was writing what I knew. That was the sort of goal. And so these were the things that I knew. These were the things that I was seeing at the time, if that makes sense.
It's the kind of knowledge of self that makes it relatable. He's not creating these characters from scratch. He knows them because they're his friends. He's sensitive to their nuances and talented enough to translate those nuances to the screen, using archetypes as a jumping off point. That's why his characters are so familiar. You might not know them, but you know them. And even though wanting to see myself on screen brushes up against representation, what makes this different than Representation Matters' trademark is how localized the stories and the characters are to his experience, and more importantly, how he plays them straight. There's no import, no pretense. My stories and experiences are naturally valuable. It's one thing to do all of this well, to engage the audience in a way where they're part of the gang, but Patrik adds additional elements to it by dramatizing more or less PSAs. He's smart to use this genre to pass off such knowledge. So in Punks, he's able to tell the audience ways in which you can and cannot contract HIV, and then the available treatments at the time for the virus in some hilarious scenes with the wonderful Loretta Devine as a health counselor named Aretha Stone. Because you're so comfortable with the characters, it comes off naturally and not preachy or, proselytizing. And I think Patrik actually drops the ball later in his career in a movie like The Skinny, where a similar scene plays like the characters are reading from a pamphlet. But at the same time, I do think it's important that scene exists because I first became aware of PrEP and PEP because of that scene. And there is a conversation to be had about the social utility of a scene vis-a-vis its artistic merit that falls outside of the context of this video, but it is certainly something that I want to return to in the episode on writing. Punks is a film that's just really good-natured and celebratory. You know the characters are going to be all right, and you can probably guess where they end up, but it's not predictable. Oh, I figured out the twist kind of way, but in a let me cheer you on kind of way, And I think that's another hard thing to do, to assure the audience that the characters are going to pull through. And yes, you know who's going to kiss at the end, but you hold out just long enough for the doubt to creep in, which I think is a really fun watch. There are many great moments in this movie, but I want to focus on two that I really love. This one where the gang spies on their new neighbor Darby. The whole sequence afterward where they actually intrude into his life is hilarious too, but this shot here is just pure visual comedy gold. And I don't know if it's that rule of whatever with the Nautilus shall look in divine numbers and art bullshit, but this is just a perfectly composed shot, literal perfection. So pleasing to look at. And then this scene where Marcus is kicked out of a one-night stand, lost in the streets, something about the tint of blue just feels like a helpless loneliness. It's a very palpable. And you're thrust into the scene in the same way that Marcus is thrust out of that man's apartment. It feels like being pushed into the Antarctic waters, the way your lungs constrict. It definitely sits weird compared to the overall tonality, narratively, sonically, visually of the rest of the film, but that's exactly why I think it has that punch. It's thematically the lowest point in the film, and I think it's the most interesting scene in the film as well. So I really do want to talk more about the movie itself, but it's actually really hard to find, and it's such a treat to watch that A, I don't want to spoil it, and B, it doesn't need any commentary from me, but I do want to switch gears to talk about the caliber of talent that worked on the film. First, costume designer Linda Stokes, who did the costumes for the She's a Bitch video, What's It Gonna Be video, Andre 3000's jumpsuits from 2014, Lil Kim's outfit for La Bella Mafia cover, and this bubble jacket from Beachella. She's just literally everybody, and her work for these drag costumes are so fucking good. The latex nun outfits, come on. Casting director Robbie Reed, who worked with Spike until the mid-90s, also casted Girlfriends, Poetic Justice, Love Jones, Harlem Nights, In Living Color, Set It Off, Undercover Brother, Antoine Fisher, Soul Food, and of course, Carmen, a hip opera. And there are legends in this movie. Seth Gilliam, Dwight Ewell, Jasmine, Loretta Devine, Rodney Chester, and of course, Kevin Aviance. Then we have legendary choreographer Marguerite Derricks, who got her start as a dancer on Fame and went on to choreograph Striptease, Showgirls, Charlie's Angels, and Full Throttle, Donnie Darko, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and all three Austin Powers, including Goldmember. Punks was one of Ava DuVernay's first gigs as a publicist, and she went on to do publicity and promotion for Raoul Peck's Lumumba, Spy Kids, The Rosa Parks Story, Badass Cinema, Shrek 3, Spider-Man 2, and Dreamgirls. Jay-Z would eventually hire her to direct the Beyoncé starring music video, Family Feud. And lastly, icon Tracy Edmonds and her husband, singer-songwriter Babyface, produced the film through their company Edmonds Entertainment. Babyface would go on to write songs for, you guessed it, Beyoncé. Basically what I'm getting at is this. Guys, we gotta do a change.org petition or something so that Athleisure Wear Lady gets this movie out of obscurity. Beyoncé, your GLAAD award is officially rescinded until then. Punks' obscurity reveals the limitations of how the film industry at large fails Black and LGBT filmmakers and audiences. The major reason why Punks is unsung is because it's in rights hell. The movie extensively uses Sister Sledge's music, the rights to which its nascent distributor Urban World Films, yes, that Urban World, couldn't afford. As such, it's a highly inaccessible film. To my understanding, it's played on Logo a couple of times in the early aughts, and a promotional DVD was issued in 2013, but I've yet to find any resellers of it. And it has streamed recently over the pandemic with Black, Gay, and Stuck at Home. It's just really sad that such a good and important movie is in some sense lost. So I want to take this opportunity to talk about the precarity of serious cinema and preservation. If you're in the life, you know Polk's work. I haven't met anyone who hasn't at least seen Noah's Ark, let alone his other works. But outside of the community, the only gay Black filmmakers seem to be Isaac Julian and Marlon Riggs, who are fantastic and beloved, but their films lend themselves to white institution. Riggs's work, for example, just got put out on the Criterion collection. It is a very messy situation when white and straight programmers and preservationists discover, quote unquote, work that is still celebrated and lauded in their communities and have been for decades. At the same time, without that attention, a lot of work remains near impossible to find or is hosted on sketchy sites like Dailymotion in very poor quality at risk of being taken down at any minute. The attention of these white culture vultures can lead to works being restored, which is great, but often the institution that programs or releases these movies hire Black people who've cozied up to them and not necessarily the ones who understand the culture of a particular where a particular movie comes from. And we have a flattening of Blackness which typically precedes erasure. As a case in point with that Criterion edition of Marlon Riggs's work, there's hardly, if any, reference to the Black gay men at the time who were weary of Tongues and Tide's call to action that Black men loving Black men is the revolutionary act, coming from someone who shacked up with a white boy. Robert Ambien presses him about this in a released-to-print interview from 1990. Carrie Allen Johnson, writing for Gay Community News, seems to find it ironic given Riggs's partner. But the point is, you can have a retrospective release that celebrates his work and the talent that he has while still keeping it real with how he was received. In fact, both Robert and Carrie double down on his talent and the importance of Tongues and Tide, but are still concerned with what Riggs might be compartmentalizing in his personal life or in the making of this film.
Marlon didn't talk about his relationship with Jack in Tongues Untied or any of his highly personal works. But when the media persisted in asking about his white lover, Marlon didn't hesitate to respond.
Do any of you have the white man in your life so you will fit in more with the white gay community?
I think it's very silly and very naive to believe that one white man or white woman, if one is lesbian, will somehow give you access to all of the privileges and power of being white in the society. What I have is a very nurturing, close, intimate, empowering relationship with one man.
And these institutions looking to get their post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter trophies don't care enough about these releases to seek out people in the know. And these Black people who work on these releases can basically rewrite history because the target audience isn't in the know. That iconic line, "Black men loving black men is the revolutionary act," actually comes from Joseph Beam's 1986 article, "Caring for Each Other," in Blackout magazine. Marlon borrowed a lot from Beam, including the refrain, "Brother to brother," which comes from Beam's seminal anthology. And even though Chaos and Collins writes about Riggs's influence in the Criterion essay, Joseph isn't mentioned. Much of Riggs's work describes the casually mundane ways white supremacy permeates society, and he dedicated himself to exposing and fighting against that. So is it any surprise that Criterion would hire the guy who was kikiing with white women calling Blue Ivy ugly to write the Riggs release essay? On the flip side, what happens to works that are important and good and popular but aren't considered serious enough to be preserved by the Film Foundation or the Library of Congress or Anthology Films or UCLA? Who is going to pay to clear Punk's music rights so it can be rediscovered in the way that Soderbergh paid for the music rights for Killer of Sheep? Without the waves that Punk made, there's no Moonlight, there's no Pose, there's no Drag Race, there's no Legend, there's nothing. Polk consistently had his hand in shaping the culture and pushing black LGBT people in the mainstream, most recently with his work on P-Valley. Yes, Marlon and Isaac are very important, but nobody was watching those films, you know what I'm saying? Like, people were tuned in to Noah's Ark, and we get Noah's Ark because of Punk's. Right? His work is rarely placed in that historical continuum by the loudest of the Representation Matters Brigade, who believe that Moonlight is the one who has done this work. Patrick does not need validation from the Lincoln Center or Criterion. He doesn't need a profile in Filmmaker magazine. What concerns me here is the future accessibility of his work, given how transient film is anyway, multiplied by decline in physical media, the revolving doors of streaming accessibility, and the oversaturation of the new kind of cotton candy movies, which drown out older media on streaming platforms. And a lack of curation. Even the nature of curation, as we've been talking about, which tends to seek out work palatable to white institutions. It's great that there is an AVI of Punks floating around and that Black, Gay, and Stuck at Home can program little live streams of it, but those aren't sustainable methods of preservation. Is this the cost of keeping our films alive? Either we circulate deteriorating copies of it, or we let white institutions quote unquote save it with all of the baggage that comes with. In the short term and the long term, it's hard to tell which is the least damaging option. And that's a sign of an unhealthy industry where we can't take productive actions, but instead are forced to take the option that best mitigates the damage of preservation under capitalism. But I do wonder what y'all think. Is this even the right framing of the issue? Is it even worth releasing Punks, assuming that it gets, restored and the rights cleared and everything? Is it worth it releasing it at $60 a pop, which is inaccessible to a lot of people who are meant to see the film? How much different is that from being lost to history anyway? Punks is definitely worth a watch if you can find it. Check in with Gay, Black, and Stuck at Home for any additional screenings that they might be doing, and maybe someone could suggest an anonymous video hosting site, in the off chance that someone, maybe a little vibrator, has the AVI of the movie, which could be uploaded and not tracked back to that little vibrator, you know what I'm saying? But that is it for this episode of Vibration Cinema. You know the drill, like, comment, and share, subscribe, etc. Next, we're going to be looking at fashion in relation to cinema. Love you all madly. See you then.